Today's mass murder in the capital city. Here is KTBC television news editor Neil Spells.
Good evening. One of history's worst mass murders occurred here in Austin today. By official count tonight, 49 persons were hit by gunfire. There are 16 dead and 33 injured. It started last night when a man reportedly killed his wife and his mother. That same man apparently rounded up an arsenal and supplies this morning and then went to the observation deck of the University of Texas Tower. It was then that terror rained down from the tower.
Imagine you are a college student going to classes, summer school classes at your university near the end before the start of the fall, expecting just an ordinary day. Well, that's what so many students on 1966 at the University of Texas in Austin expected. Instead, what followed was 90 minutes of terror, which actually began the night before and resulted in the deaths of 21 people, 2 the night before, 16 the day of the shooting, including an 8-month unborn fetus, and later on the death of the shooter, as well as a gentleman that was wounded that day but died from complications 20 years later. What we're talking about today, people, is Charles Whitman and the Deadly Tower. Let's get into it. And as always, this video is brought to you by our brand new full channel partner, Keto Crisp. The wonderful folks over at tastecando.com have officially signed on to partner with me in both my weight loss journey, which I am back on now, as well as sponsoring the channel. They have signed me up for a brand new affiliate program. So if you click the link down below, as well as put in my discount code, you'll receive 15% off your first order, and I do get a tiny commission if you do purchase. So it helps the channel and you get something tasty and healthy. These are great bars. They satisfy. They keep you full for a long time. They have a lot of great nutrients, a lot of great natural ingredients. And for those of us in the keto and low carb world, we've often been demonized as not a friend to the animals, but these are 100% plant-based. So you can feel good about that too if you are of the vegetarian or vegan keto lifestyle. These are also for you. So with that being said, I want to say a huge shout out to Keto Crisp for sponsoring the channel and helping me to stay on the air here. And thank you all. So if you'd like to order some, definitely check them out below. I appreciate it. All right, guys, this is a difficult one. Charles Whitman and the University of Texas Austin massacre of 1966, August 1st, 1966. Let's get into it. Charles Whitman Jr. was born June 24th, 1941 to Charles Sr. and Margaret Whitman, Lake Forth, Florida. Charles Sr., pictured here, and here's Charles Jr., the would-be sniper, was an orphan. He was raised in an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia, not knowing his family or his lineage, and was in every aspect a self-made man. He even said that. He eventually went on to build a successful contracting business, including a plumbing distribution company. He married Margaret when she was 17 years old and proceeded to have 3 sons, Charles Jr. being the oldest. Charles Sr. was, by all accounts, a gun and hunting enthusiast. He trained all 3 of his sons to be the same. There were many pictures of them getting gifts of guns and hunting and learning how to shoot, which is actually a very valuable skill for someone living in the South to have. I was raised with guns, but evidently in some people it translates just a little bit differently. Charles Jr., in fact, all of the boys were devout Catholics, having served as altar boys. They all went into Boy Scouting. Charles having the distinct honor of becoming the America's youngest Eagle Scout at the age of 12. And if you're involved in scouting, you know what a huge accomplishment that is. Charles was credited with having a IQ of 139, so he was near genius level. He was a decorated Eagle Scout marksman by the age of 16. He also did some younger Boy Scout troop, like Cub Scout mentoring, and became a junior scoutmaster, in which some boys recounted how he would put money down, like $1 down on the ground, which is a lot of money in 1966, especially for a kid, and say, if you can do what I can do, you can have that money. Well, he would do very difficult stuff like backwards push-ups or doing push-ups while standing on his head, and of course none of the boys could ever match that, so he would snatch the money away and basically berate them for being weak. Now, I suppose standards of etiquette were very different in the 60s, so that was probably allowed, but oh my God. Wow. He was also taught by his father to be an entrepreneur, so he established a very large paper route for himself. By the time he was in high school, he saved enough money to buy a Harley Davidson from doing that route, and then used that Harley Davidson to expand his paper route into an even bigger one, covering a couple of cities, and actually paid his own way through high school. So he was a very a young man with a lot of ingenuity, for a lack of a better way to put it. As I'd already pointed out, he was a very stern scoutmaster, having been disciplined a couple of times for that, but still excelled as an Eagle Scout himself. At the age of 18, he went out with some friends to celebrate his 18th birthday, and got drunk and came home drunk. His father became so enraged that he beat him and threw him in the swimming pool. Now, this was just the culmination of years of abuse, because Charles Sr. was not only a domineering father and trained his sons in a very particular way, with a very particular set of skills, that he also waged a heavy hand over Margaret and beat her mercilessly for the majority of their marriage. He was even quoted as saying, "Yes, I beat my wife, but I love her." Now, he can keep that love for all I care. But the night of his 18th birthday, he was severely beaten by his father and thrown into the swimming pool, which caused him to take the money that he had worked for and leave. He then enlisted in the Marines just a couple of days afterwards, and left in July to go to basic training at Parris Island, the same place my father went through basic training in the Marines. A lot earlier than this, though. And eventually was assigned an 18-month stint at Gitmo, Cuba, or Guantanamo Bay, as it's usually known. His father, who was very highly connected in Florida, attempted to reach out to some legislatures and get his enlistment canceled, because he was just enraged that Charlie would join the Marines and not want to go into his business, but those attempts failed. So by 1960, he joined in 1959. By 1960, he had earned both the Sharpshooter's Badge and the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal, which just pointed out exceptional Marines, exceptionally talented Marines. And building on his high IQ and the fact he had had excellent grades in high school, he applied to the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. And for those of you that don't know, the Marines are an extension of the Navy. They're naval infantrymen. So hence they're ever encompassed with the Navy. And he applied to the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps scholarship program. He was intending to complete college and become a second lieutenant, a commissioned second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. His application was accepted, and they asked him to study engineering, specifically mechanical engineering, because those are getting to the Corps of Engineers, whether it's Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, whatever's a high honor. Those are the highest paid positions. They're the positions that have the most chances of employment, both within the military and outside the military. Very coveted position. So anybody that gets into that corps, whether they study engineering on their own or the government actually pays for them to achieve their degree, it's the highest honor, one of the highest honors. So he was accepted and sent to the University of Texas to study mechanical engineering, all paid by the Department of the Navy, in 1961. Picture this. A 20-year-old that is just now out of a very domineering household where he was under the thumb of his father, then directly into the Marine Corps, where again, I've been in the Army, their whole thing is to break you completely down to nothing and build you back up the way they want you. So essentially your will is not your own. That's just the way it works in the military. It has to for safety reasons. So imagine him going from an atmosphere being raised like that with his father, and now the Marine Corps to now being a college student, because he went from being, he was still in the Marine Corps, but he went from being an active duty Marine to more of a reserve status, and he could live a civilian life except for the, summer and weekends of training that the Marine Corps reserves required of him. And he was basically on his own with nobody standing over him for the first time in his life. And he went crazy by all accounts. He was a poor student at first. He neglected his studies, barely passed with C's his first semester or two. He got into gambling and was known to throw beer parties at his dorm where he would literally fill up his bathtub with ice and fill it full of beer and invite people over. He also was arrested by Austin police for poaching a deer. He and some friends went out and basically shot a deer illegally. They were seen out of deer season. They were seen. Their tag was reported to police. Police tracked them to University of Texas at Austin, excuse me, and found the three men actually skinning and breaking down the deer in their dorm room. And they were fined $100, which was a huge amount of money in 1966. So he was on the fast track to nowhere. But he did, in February of 1962, met Miss Kathleen Leissner, who by all accounts was an all-American girl from Needleville, Texas. She was studying to be a high school biology teacher, worked really hard, got straight A's, was sweet, nice, and it had a very calming effect on Charles. He fell immediately in love with her, and you couldn't, on the outside, it was like Barbie and Ken. Eagle Scout Marine with all-American girl studying to be a teacher. And for a long time, they had a great effect on each other, and they ended up getting married very quickly. About 7 months later, in August of 1962, in her hometown, they were married. But unfortunately, Charlie's early days, being a miscreant, for lack of a better term, caught up with him, and the Marines revoked his scholarship. And that, coupled with the fact his behavior, coupled with the fact that the Cuban Missile Crisis was occurring and we were on high alert for a possible war with the Soviet Union at the time, led them to want to call as many people back to active duty as they could. So they used his bad grades and prior behavior as an excuse to pull him from reserve back to active duty status. They revoked his scholarship, forced him to leave Austin and go to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where he was immediately sent back to active duty. He was immediately taken out of the commissioning program, put back as an enlisted. He was promoted instantly from private first class to lance corporal, and basically made a soldier again. He was not happy about this. His exemplary behavior of his first part of his enlistment, because he had enlisted for 5 years, went down the tubes. He was not interested in being in the Marines, didn't want to be there, wanted to be back with his wife and continue his education in Austin, but was trapped, essentially. So he began actually writing and calling his father, begging him to use his influence to get him out. And his father did start that process. But in the meantime, Charlie had one good thing to happen. He did rescue a person from a flip Jeep single-handedly, another Marine, and was decorated for that, and spent a few days in the hospital from injury. So he was still had the skills to be a good Marine. But beyond that, he got into gambling, illegally loaning money to other Marines, and then fighting with them when they didn't pay him back. He also had illegal firearms on the Marine base. When you're in the military, you're only allowed to have your issued firearms, not your own, unless you have a special permit. So he was doing that outside, and ended up, because of all of that, being court-martialed in 1963, spending 30 days in the brig or jail, 90 days at hard labor, and was busted from lance corporal back down to private 2 levels down for the remainder of his enlistment. It was during his imprisonment in the brig. It was during his imprisonment in the brig, and later on, during his 90 days of hard labor, he began writing obsessively. He wrote what you see here, The Daily Record of C.J. Whitman. And you can actually purchase this if you're so inclined. Go to Amazon. I know you can find it there. I've read portions of it. It's very interesting. I mean, he wrote his thoughts on death, life, mostly about how much he hated his father. He hated the Marines. He hated the failure he'd become because he never thought he could live up to his father's expectations, which were high. So he felt like a failure in every sense of the word, and began writing down his daily thoughts, essentially because he had nothing else to do. And finally, in 1964, he was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps, and I bet you're wondering how, with everything that he had done. He should have received a dishonorable discharge, let's be honest, but thanks to his father's political connections in Florida, he was able to get an honorable discharge. His father then tried to pressure him to return to Florida and work with he and his brothers in his contracting business. Charles refused because he did not want to be back under his father's thumb, and moved back to Texas to be with Kathy, who was finishing her degree at the University of Texas, and eventually gained employment as a high school biology teacher in the Austin City school system. She also took on a second job during the summer as a telephone operator. Remember, this is the 60s, so you still had Josephine, the operator, sitting there connecting your calls. So she did that during the summer and sometimes at night during the school year, because upon his discharge, except for being able to use the GI Bill to pay for his college, he did re-enroll in the University of Texas in architectural engineering because he couldn't decide between regular engineering or mechanical engineering as he had been before, or being an architect. He settled on architectural engineering and resumed his studies at the University of Texas. He did work some odd jobs, but could never quite balance being an academic with being a worker. So literally, his wife, Kathy, was supporting them both working as a teacher and a job as a phone operator. And this weighed heavily on Charles. He began to stress over it because he felt he had been a failure. His father always supported their family, and here it was his wife working to support them. Whereas I think in a normal frame of mind, you would realize this: I'm in school, I'm studying a very difficult major, engineering, so my wife is just supporting me while I complete this degree and then go out and get a really high-paying job so that she can be a homemaker or a teacher and a mother or whatever she wants to do in the future, as most normal people would think. But he wasn't. He was thinking this just compounding him being a failure. So to compensate, he decided he was going to make straight A's. So he began studying all the time, staying up for days at a time trying to study. And to help him do that, he went out and got a prescription for speed or amphetamines and got addicted and hooked on amphetamines. And as a result of just being in this drug-induced depressive stupor, began beating Kathy. So you can say he was very definitely following in his father's footsteps in a lot of ways. March of 1966, we're getting very close to the date of the shooting. His parents divorced. His mother actually was rescued by police officers at their home because neighbors heard them fighting and that they thought they were going to kill each other earlier in the month. So police came, found them mid-fight, separated the two of them. She left. She called Charles from a hotel room and asked him to please come get her. He came and got her along with one of his brothers and brought them back to Austin. His younger brother went out on his own and went to college and kind of made a life for himself in Austin. His mother did too. Margaret actually went and got a job at a cafeteria. Now, think of like a Piccadilly or a Pioneer or something like that. A cafeteria like you would normally see in school, but it's in restaurant form. They used to be very popular, starting in the 60s all the way through the 90s, as far as I can remember. So she worked in that type of restaurant as a cashier. So she got that. She got an apartment on her own, but was never happy because she was used to being under the thumb of a man, and that has a huge psychological effect on somebody when they break free of an abuser. And she was living hand to mouth, which she had plenty with her husband. And their divorce was not yet final, so things like alimony and things like that had not yet been settled. And alimony wasn't as prevalent in the 60s as it is now, so chances are she might not have gotten anything like that. So she was living a hand-to-mouth existence and was kind of depressed. And of course, that had a huge effect on Charles, who was trying to help her all he can, but because he wasn't working and depending on his wife for support, it just all compounded in his mind. It was about this time that, again, he went back to his old ways of trying to earn all A's to compensate. That was compounded by the amphetamines, the fact that now his father, Charles Sr., was calling him daily. In fact, Charles Sr. was quoted having spent over $8,000 in long-distance calls. Remember, this is the 60s. There's no free long-distance calling. That's my wife, by the way, if you can see her. She's going to kill me for putting her on camera. She likes to take funny pictures and put them on my phone, unbeknownst to me. So there's one that she did. But he had spent, so you still had to pay for long distance. So imagine spending $8,000 in a year on long distance. And that was no small amount of money. That was probably more like 30 grand in 2019. So think about that. So he had all this pressure, his father wanting him to convince his mother to come home, his younger brother to come home, him to come home, and Kathy to come to Florida, and all live and work together in Florida. So he did not want to get that much back under his father's control, so he was refusing. And then with everything else, he just started to spiral. Not to mention, Charles began having severe headaches and nausea. Unbeknownst to him, he thought it was a side effect of the amphetamines, which he was regularly abusing right now. Kathy, even though she was now scared of Charles, she started trying to convince him to go see a psychiatrist and get some help, which he actually did later that month in March of 1966. And at that psychiatric appointment, he confessed that he had visions of going up to the tower, the observation clock tower at University of Texas, Austin, and shooting people. His psychiatrist wrote it up as a black fantasy, a dark fantasy, and didn't really dwell on it, but did ask him to come back for another appointment, which Charles skipped. So he began, and this goes back to earlier, his first round of college before he lost his Marine Corps Naval Scholarship. He actually quoted when they were in the bookstore to those same friends he was poaching the deer with that the clock tower would be the perfect place to stage a sniping session because it was impenetrable. So all of this is starting to build up. He began to write even more obsessively about the evil of his father, the goodness of his wife and mom, and his own failures. His writings got really dark. If you are so inclined, I highly recommend you get that daily diary of C.J. Whitman. It's an interesting read. The parts that I read of it, very interesting. He often wrote that his reasons for feeling this way and even his reasons for writing were unclear to him. The summer of 1966 was a hot one for Texas. Now, Texas is hot anyway, but it was incredibly hot. You had highs of near 130. And it was blistering in the Whitman home because Charles and Kathy could not afford air conditioning. Now, air conditioning was not standard like it is now. It was a luxury because you had all window units, but it was still a luxury and they were pretty expensive, so not everyone had them. So he was suffering from the intense heat, the amphetamines, headaches that were unexplained, and he started to go over the deep end. On July 31st, 1966, he got up early in the morning. He went shopping. He went to a sporting goods store, bought a knife and binoculars where his ID was not checked when he offered to write a check. He, which was actually turned out to be bad, and we'll talk about that. But his ID was not, this was 1966. Everybody trusted everyone. You could say that this event was starting to snap the innocence, along with the Manson murders and things like that, starting to snap the innocence of the country in the 60s. Because you had, remember, Charles Whitman was born in 1941. He wasn't a baby boomer, but he was more of what they call the greatest generation. But his brothers were baby boomers, and so you had a lot of unrest from the baby boomers at this time. You had the protesting the Vietnam War. You had the assassination of JFK. You had the Cuban Missile Crisis. You had so much. You had the civil rights unrest going on. It was a scary time in America, and you can see how this helped shatter that. even more, even in the heartland where this was. But everybody considered all that happening in D.C. and out in California, but this is the heartland. And this, along with the assassination of JFK earlier in 1963, kind of snapped that illusion that the heartland was safe. So, but there was still some remnants of that, post-World War trust, Eisenhower trust, that was still there, and hence you never had people check IDs or turn in any kind of documentation when people bought guns or knives or anything. And in fact, when she was interviewed, the clerk at the sporting goods store said he looked like such a nice boy. So he bought a knife, binoculars, at a sporting goods store. He started going around to different sporting goods stores buying some ammo. He went to a 7-Eleven convenience store and bought several cans of Spam, like a whole case of Spam. And then he went home, put the stuff in the garage, went to have lunch with Kathy and his mom at the cafeteria where she worked near the University of Texas. Then afterwards ran some more errands, and then took Kathy to her at 5:30 to her shift at the phone company where she was working from 6 to 10. He took her into work at 5:30 because she liked to be there early. And then he went home and about 6:45 and started writing a suicide note. In the suicide note, he wrote that he had no idea why he was about to do what he was doing. He felt compelled to do it. He confessed he was going to kill both his mother and Kathy to spare them the embarrassment of being married and having a son that was a complete failure, as well as the embarrassment of what else he was about to do, even though he didn't specifically say he was going to go to the University of Texas and shoot it up. He did allude to the fact he was going to do something dark. Also, he wrote, he asked for an autopsy and just asked that people analyze his writings to hopefully they could make out some sense. He picked up his wife from her shift about 10 p.m., brought her home. She was working a double shift the next day, so she had to be up early, so she immediately took a shower and went to bed. He called his mother and asked if he could come study in her air-conditioned apartment, which was not unusual for him to do. So after Kathy went to bed, he did go over to his mother's house about midnight. As soon as she opened the door, let him in, and closed it, he attacked her. He pushed her up against the wall, knocked her down, and basically bludgeoned her with the butt of a knife until her skull was crushed. They believe that she died very quickly. He had alluded in his writings he wanted their deaths to be painless, and he kept that promise. He bludgeoned her until she was no longer moving, turned her over, stabbed her 3 times, and then lifted her up, put her in her bed, covered her up as if she was dead, sat there, wrote a note confessing that he had killed his mother and saying if there was a heaven, he has no doubt that she's there and in a better place, and it was much better than the 25 years of torture she went through with his father, and that I hate my father and my father is forcing me to do this. I mean, he wanted it all laid at the feet of his father for sure. He then left his mother's apartment and near sometime between 12 and 3 a.m. and closed the door, put a note on the door saying, "Please do not disturb, sick," and then went home, where he immediately entered his and Kathy's bedroom with a knife, presumably the same knife he used to kill his mother, and stabbed Kathy 3 to 5 times in the chest. She immediately went from sleep to death. She didn't feel a thing. He then covered her over with the sheet and again went over to the suicide note he had already written for himself and them. Instead of typing, because he liked to type, he simply took blue ink and wrote in the bottom, 3 a.m., both dead, which is how we know that both Margaret and Kathy were dead by 3 a.m. on August 1st, 1966. The next morning, he called his wife out at 5:45 a.m. because she had to be there at 6 and explained that she was very sick and couldn't be there. Later on that morning, about 10:45, he also called his mother out of work since she had to be there about 11. He also took the time to write detailed notes to his brothers explaining why he did what he did and instructions for developing 2 rolls of film, which later on revealed to be family photos, pictures of guns, things of that nature. In addition to the bad checks he had written before for the Spam and the in the knife and the binoculars. He also cashed another additional $250 in bad checks and then went around to several more stores buying more ammo, more spam, and a transistor radio. He then he comes home after that, loads his Marine footlocker with the spam, the radio, the ammo, and 7 firearms, including a Ruger, his Marine Corps sniper rifle, several other things, and that knife. Still the knife that he's already used to kill his family. He's washed it and he's put it in his trunk. He also went out and rented a dolly, which he put his footlocker on, and headed for the University of Texas at Austin. He used a fake ID saying he was a research fellow because it was still kind of guarded. I mean, especially on a college campus, especially with all the civil unrest and protests going on. He used a fake ID revealing him to be a research assistant to Park. He went into the first floor and saw Vera Palmer, an employee standing there. He went over to the elevators. The elevator was shut down, so he then went over to the freight elevator. Vera Palmer actually helped him activate it, and he told her, "Thank you so much, ma'am. You have no idea how happy this has made me." He then got into the elevator and proceeded up to the 27th floor observation deck, reception area. All right, everyone, here you have a picture of the University of Texas Bell Tower. Here you see the tower itself. It's 27 stories tall. Here's the observation deck where Whitman staged his attack. Here is the quad surrounded by academic buildings and the rest of the campus. Behind it, here you have Guadalupe Street, which is a kind of a business district and hang, so it has coffee shops, private businesses, that sort of thing, just behind the campus. Okay, when Whitman entered, he entered through the main parking lot here at the front, walked across the quad, again with his dolly and his footlocker, entered here at the bottom, took the elevator up to the 27th floor receptionist area, which would have been right about here. There would have been a set of stairs that would have connected it on up to the tower. He took the freight elevator up, and when he got off carrying, wheeling a dolly, he was confronted by Edna Townsley, who was a 51-year-old receptionist. She was actually that was not her full-time job. She was just filling in that Monday for them. She confronted him. He immediately attacked her and ended up bludgeoning her to death with the butt of a rifle, so much that he crushed her entire skull. He moved her immediately in behind a couch. He took his footlocker and began dragging the dolly and the footlocker up the stairs out the front entrance of the tower, which would have been right over here. You can't really see it, but around this corner. He also barricaded the final set of stairs by using chairs, tables, that sort of thing, and was planning to barricade himself in by using the dolly as a brace against the doorknob of the door leading out to the observation deck. But while he was doing this, you had a family of tourists that was coming up to use the observation deck, the Gabor family. That included 19-year-old Mike, who was on leave from the U.S. Air Force Academy, his 16-year-old brother Mark, his aunt Margaret Lamport, and his mother Mary Frances Gabor were all coming up to use the tower. Well, the kids immediately started jumping the barricade. That's something I don't understand, but I guess kids will be kids. So Whitman came back down and started firing on them. He struck Mike Gabor, 19-year-old, in the through the shoulder. He also immediately shot Mark, the 16-year-old, in the head, immediately rendering him dead. He also shot Marguerite Lamport in the chest, killing her instantly, and wounding the mother, Mary Frances Gabor. Once they were dead or wounded, he thought all of them were dead. He moved back up into the observation deck, closed the door, used the top of the dolly to secure the entrance. And if you've ever come up against a door that has its doorknob jammed, it's very difficult to get in. So he immediately started going around the tower, leaving weapons every few feet. He started leaving weapons every few feet because his plan was to run around and around the tower, taking shots from all four sides, and having a weapon at his ready everywhere. So that's what he began to do. And then within a few minutes, I think just before noon on that faithful day, he started taking his first shots toward the quad here. And that's what happened the first few minutes after Charles Whitman entered the observation area on the 27th floor of the clock tower. Within minutes, he started firing at the quad below on the front side of the building, and his first victim was Claire Wilson, who was 18 and 8 months pregnant. And he sized her up. Remember, he had a sniper rifle. He sized her up right in her pregnant belly and shot her through the belly, instantly killing the 8-month fetus and critically wounding Miss Wilson. Her boyfriend, Thomas Frederick Ekman, who was also 18, of course, reached down to help her, and he was shot through the head, killing him instantly. Now, from here, he started to do his plan of running around the tower, picking up the different weapons and firing from all sides, and began picking off people left and right. There was a paper boy that was 17 years old doing the same job that, ironically, Whitman had done to pay his way through high school, was shot while delivering papers. There was university grad students that were shot entering bookstores on Guadalupe Street, the business sector. There were business people and students shot there coming out of coffee shops, coming out of work, going to work, walking down the street. People started falling left and right around. And the reason I don't outline every single victim is that you can very easily online find them. There were mostly injuries, thank goodness, but we still had about 16 people die on this day, not including the family before, the night before, and him. So as you can imagine the amount of chaos that's ensuing. Within 4 minutes of that first shot being fired, you had a history professor that called 911, and you immediately had officers on the scene. As soon as that first call came into 911, at this time you had a very close relationship between law enforcement and the media. The media was a very respected thing. There's not all this fake news and things like, and arguments about what's fake news and what's not that you have today. The media was a very respected thing, and they had a very close relationship with law enforcement. So law enforcement started to alert KTBC, which was the largest news station in Austin, something was going on. They also heard it on their police scanner. So you had Neil Spless, who was the news director at the time, jump into one of their red cars called Red Rover and go immediately over to Austin, and he began broadcasting play-by-play analysis of what was going on from what he could see from driving around campus, putting himself in harm's way to alert the police and alert the public of what was going on. Now remember, this is 1966, long before Al Gore invented the internet. So there was no instant news. There was no instant coverage of what was going on. You did have to rely on the media to give that to you. And he was driving around giving play-by-play of what was happening from what he could see. You also had Gary Pickle, who parked his news van and went into a academic building not far from the clock tower and started taking all of the pictures and footage that you see. Some of the footage I showed before, some of the footage that you could find by very easily Googling is mostly Mr. Pickle's footage that he took under fire from that academic building. Excuse me, I still have my sinus going on. Phil Miller was probably put himself in the greatest amount of harm's way as he got right out on the quad behind some fencing and literally filmed a lot of the shots coming from the clock tower, as well as filming the quad around. He also reported shot by shot live into his radio so that it could be picked up by both radio and TV stations. He also attempted to help many of the victims that he saw shot down, including police officer Billy Paul Speed, who earlier that morning had been sitting with his partner, Jerry Day, in their cruiser, talking about how he was going to turn in his notice that day because he just felt that he was going to be killed eventually. And he ended up kind of having a premonition of his own death, I suppose, because he was the first officer on the scene when the call came in, and he raced to the clock tower, got up to the fencing where Phil Miller was already hunkered down with his camera and his broadcasting radio, and attempted to he started shooting up at the clock tower. And that's what you have to realize, is that not only were police shooting, you had ordinary citizens that were pulling rifles, shotguns, and pistols out of their cars, their trucks, their bags, and started hunkering down, taking shots at the sniper or snipers in the tower. And one other thing that made this such a strategic area is the fact that so many Texas citizens, I remember Texas is an open carry state, so many Texas citizens took their own weapons, began hiding all around the tower, taking pot shots up. Well, the majority of them had, low-powered hunting rifles. Even the police had low-powered handguns that could barely breach the distance between the ground and the tower. So he was very strategic in why he chose this. So if you fire a gun, even a hunting rifle, from here, you're going to hit somewhere around here. You're not ever going to reach him. Very few are going to be able to reach him. In the fray also, the police even sent in an airplane from the Guadalupe Street side with a police sharpshooter in it to try to pick him or them off. As I said, they didn't know at this time whether it was 1 or 5 shooters. The way he was traveling around the tower and shooting, it was very hard to determine that. But they sent an airplane with a sharpshooter to try to pick him or them off, and Whitman was able to take up here on the Guadalupe side of the tower, rest his arm, point his sharpshooter rifle up, and start taking pot shots at the airplane. Well, a couple of them hit the airplane, and it was at that time that the pilot decided, we got to get out of here. So they move away. So he even survived an air assault, which is just amazing to me. He was a brilliant tactician, even though he was evil. And if there is a hell, I hope he's burning in it. But this was some stuff, y'all. This is, of all the cases I've researched, this one blew my mind. But let's get back into it, shall we? But Officer Speed was the first one on the scene, so he was attempting to kind of get a range of what was going on, and Whitman got a bead on him through about a 6-inch opening in a white fence that Phil Miller was also hiding behind, and shot him dead, point blank. Not point blank, but dead through the head through a 6-inch opening. That's how accurate Whitman's marksmanship was. Dude could have been a badass if he had used it for good, let me just tell you. So you have a lot of chaos. This lasted about 90 to 96 minutes in total. And in the meantime, you had people taking pot shots at the tower. You had people hunkered down for survival. You had people running out to pull the wounded out of the line of fire at risk to their own. I mean, you don't mess with Texas. Texas will come around. So you had people fighting back. You had people rescuing other people. My props to the people of Austin, Texas. But this is where enter in some key players in ending this tragedy. You had police officer Houston McCoy and Jerry Day. Jerry Day was Billy Paul Speed's partner. He teamed up with Houston McCoy and made a run for the tower. One of them went through the front entrance. One of them went through a utility tunnel at the bottom trying to get into the tower. You also had Officer Ramiro Martinez, who was actually off duty that day. When he heard what was going on, he says, I have to go help. So he called the police precinct, and they told him, please go to the university and help direct traffic away from it. Because you had all of these reporters there risking their lives, telling people, stay away from the University of Texas, giving the police step-by-step of what was going on the campus. So Ramiro Martinez went with the expectation of directing traffic, but somehow found himself on the campus near the bell tower, and he made a run for the entrance. At the front of the entrance, you had a civilian by the name of Alan Crum, who was a former World War II tail gunner, and he was the manager of a bookstore that was across the street from the bell tower, sort of on the other side on the Guadalupe Street, and he knew he was pinned down and couldn't get back. He had left the shop when he saw the 17-year-old paperboy get shot down and had gone to help the people that were trying to help him get him to safety, but unfortunately he had already died. So he was kind of trapped on the University of Texas side, knowing he couldn't get back without putting himself directly into the line of fire. So he hunkered down on the back side of the tower with his shotgun, just waiting. And eventually Ramiro Martinez approached him, and he
He said, I'm going in. And Alan said, I know the layout of this building. Let me help you, please. Let me help you get this sumbitch. That's exactly what he said. So Ramiro said, come on, but at your own risk. So they go through the back entrance of the tower into the lobby, and they eventually make their way up to the 27th floor, where officers Day and Houston McCoy have already gotten there. When they get there, they find Mike Garber, who is Mike Gabor, who is the 19-year-old that was shot at the beginning, still alive. He's laying there with the bodies of his aunt and brother, still alive. And Officer McCoy asks him, how many people are up there? He said, I only saw one, and please give me your gun and let me kill the son of a bitch. And Officer McCoy said he put his hand on Mike's, who Mike would go on to survive, put his hand on his shoulder and said, son, I'll kill him for you. So they were going up there not to arrest this guy, but to kill him. That was obvious. And so eventually McCoy, Speed, remember the officer that had already died, his partner Jerry Day was there. They asked Jerry Day to stay with Mike and also to keep people from coming up the steps to the observation deck. And so Ramiro Martinez, Alan Crum, and Ramiro Martinez went up to the door of the observation deck and attempted to open it, but remember, Whitman had put his dolly there underneath the doorknob, and they couldn't get it open without making a lot of noise. So eventually they just slammed into it, trying to get it open. They still couldn't. But then you had public safety agent Dub Cohen, who also made his way up to the observation deck, kind of with enough muscle to get that door open. So with all four of them charging into it, they were actually able to get it open. It failed, but they speculate that Whitman didn't hear it because he was firing. So they were able to get away out without making that much noise. So they get out on the ledge. Cohen stays behind to help Officer Jerry Day, and McCoy, Ramirez, and Crum go out onto the tower. Ramiro Martinez looks at Alan Crum and sends him around to the right, around the observation deck hub, and tells him just to hold his gun forward, walk. If anybody comes around that's not them, just shoot them dead. 66 was Wild Wild West, let me tell you. So he tells him just to go around and hold his gun out like that. Well, then the two officers, McCoy and Martinez, go around to the left, and they're attempting to kind of pin off whoever it is. So Alan Crum is continuing to slowly walk around the building. Something kind of spooks him, and he fires a shot. Well, this alerts Whitman, and Whitman stops firing and looks to his right. This actually turned out to be a good thing because it allowed McCoy and Martinez to kind of get a drop on him. They jumped out. They saw him kind of hunkered down next to the ledge. They stepped out. He started to turn his gun on them. They turned their guns on him and just started rapid firing. Martinez emptied his entire revolver, he said, in what felt like 2 seconds. McCoy had a shotgun. As soon as Ramirez emptied his handgun, he grabbed McCoy's rifle and charged at Whitman, who was by all accounts already dead, and fired one point-blank shot to Whitman's face to make sure he was dead. And about that time, Alan Crum actually put a white flag on the butt of his gun, a white handkerchief, because this is before Kleenex, or handkerchiefs were still widely used. He put a white handkerchief on the butt of his gun and started waving it above, because remember, you had people down below still taking pot shots at the tower. All they hear is gunfire, so they think the gunman or gunmen are still alive, and they're continuing to fire at the tower, which could have killed anybody else on top. So Crum is waving his white flag, trying to let people know that it's over. Finally, the shooting stops, and law enforcement and paramedics are allowed into the building. In all, there was 16 people dead that day, not including the gunman, his wife and mother, and then another gentleman who was shot and died 20 to 30 years later from complications of his injuries. He had 33 injured and alive. At the time, a as per his suicide note, after identifying him, they went to his house. They found the body of his wife. They found all his writings. That tipped them off that he had killed his mother. They went over to her apartment, found her body, and started to slowly piece the story together. An autopsy on Charles Whitman revealed a tumor near his amygdala, which could cause both rage and a condition called hyperglycemia, which is basically obsessive writing of your every thought you have. So a lot of people thought that if it hadn't been for this tumor, none of this would ever have happened, that it just completely changed his personality. What do you think? Do you think that the tumor caused it, or do you think he was just essentially had murder in his blood? In any case, this changed American crime forever. This is probably the largest at the time mass shooting in American history. It ushered in a whole new sense of we're not safe in the public anymore, and it affected the heartland. So this was a pivotal case in American crime for sure, and it was a very interesting case to study. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made sense to you. Let me know what you think. Do you think it was the tumor? Do you think he had mental illness before the tumor, or do you think he was just a crazy bastard? Let me know down below. Let me know your thoughts. If you're old enough to remember anything about this or have studied it before, let me know. Thank you. Like, comment, subscribe. Ketosis, y'all. Keto Comic.